Welcome to Raven Chronicles Press's official launch of our republication of Kathleen Alcalà's novel, Spirits of the Ordinary, A Tale of Casas Grandes. And this is the book with the artwork by Alfredo Arreguín. Beautiful horse. I'm Phoebe Boucher, the managing editor of Raven Chronicles, which is a Seattle shoreline-based independent press and literary organization. This is the very last of 3 regional digital events to launch our exciting reissue of Kathleen's novel. Joining us today is the author Kathleen Alcalá from her home on Bainbridge Island, and the author of the new foreword to the book, Rigoberto González, is coming from his home in New Jersey. Rigoberto will lead the conversation and discussion. Also joining us, my thanks go to Tech Tom Stiles, who's a jackstraw engineer. I'd like to thank our sponsors this year who have been great with relief funds and mostly relief funds. It's For Culture of King County, the City of Seattle's Office of Arts and Culture, and the Washington State Arts Commission, which has given us relief NEA funding for project support for 2021. I think everyone knows about muting, so I don't have to go through that anymore, but please use the chat, and we are going to be posting information about buying the book, about the bios for the 2 people joining us today, so use chat. Rigoberto González is the author of 18 books of poetry and prose. His awards include Lannan, Guggenheim, NEA, the PEN Volcker Award, the American Book Award from the Before Columbus Foundation, the Lenore Marshall Prize from the Academy of American Poets, and the Shelley Memorial Prize from the Poetry Society of America, and many, many more. A critic at large for the LA Times and a contributing editor for Poets and Writers magazine. He is the series editor for the Camino del Sol Latinx literary series, which is at the University of Arizona Press. Currently, he's Distinguished Professor of English and the director of the MFA program in creative writing at Rutgers, Newark, the State University of New Jersey. Kathleen Alcalá is a writer whose work embraces both traditional and innovative storytelling. Kathleen is the author of 6 award-winning books that include a collection of short stories, 3 novels, an essay collection, and a blueprint for sustainability, the wonderful book about Bainbridge Island, The Deepest Roots, Finding Food and Community on a Pacific Northwest Island. She's the daughter of Mexican parents, and she was born and raised in California, and she now lives here with us in the Pacific Northwest. Rigoberto.
Thank you, Phoebe, and thank you to Raven Chronicles for hosting this wonderful event. We are indeed here to celebrate Kathleen Alcalá's Spirits of the Ordinary, a book that's very close to my heart, which is why I agreed to not only write the foreword, but to also participate in this conversation. But first and foremost, I think Kathleen is going to read for us just a small portion so that her voice can be in the room, and then we'll take it from there. Kathleen.
Thank you, Rigo. Thanks, everyone, for turning out tonight. I really appreciate it. A sudden flight of birds or movement of wind made Estella stop and gaze out the window. She did not say why, but she felt a lightness she had not felt in many years. She should feel terrible, she thought, left alone to cope with the household by herself, her surly father, the prying neighbors, an abandoned woman. Estella tried to feel sorry for herself, something she'd done often enough before, but today she could not. The last flowers of the season were still blooming. Her daughters played in the courtyard, their embroidery in a careless heap on a table. Gabriel read in a corner of the patio, his feet up, sweet tea at hand. My little man, she thought. Zacarias was gone again, but this time she had done something about it. Perhaps that was the difference.
Thank you, Kathleen. You know, the character of Estela, I'm glad you read that passage because the echoes that reach all the way forward to Treasures in Heaven are very much there. Estela, who is always a strong character, who's always in a moment of struggle, and yet she's always managed to overcome so much. And the challenge for her in Spirits of the Ordinary was the husband, right? For one, the husband. Before we get into sort of like the broader scope of the novel, I want to ask you about is Estela one of your favorite characters for you as it is for me?
Yeah, I guess so. It's hard to play favorites, especially in a book with so many characters. I was saying earlier that I did a lot of things in this book that I would not advise students to do. One of them was having a lot of main characters. And Estela, I thought of as being there to counterbalance Zacarias, her husband. And I really saw the book wrapped around the two of them, almost like, you know, those models of DNA, the two loops going around. And so when I wrote this book, that's how I envisioned them, as balancing each other.
Because you have so many characters, did you already have in mind that there was going to be a trilogy?
When I finished the first book, Spirits of the Ordinary, I realized that it would be a trilogy, yes. But not before then. And I couldn't convince Chronicle Books that it was going to be a trilogy.
Really?
Until I wrote all three, yeah.
Oh, wow. I didn't know that about the process. So you had written all three before you actually got the publisher to accept all three? Is that it?
No, I wrote the first one, and it didn't get placed right away. And so I started the second one. So by the time Spirits of the Ordinary was published, I was able to publish The Flower and the Skull a year later, and everybody went, "Oh, you're such a fast writer. You just zoomed along." And I thought, no, it took a while. But it did have forward momentum once I got started, because I knew, since it was based on family history, I knew a lot of general idea of what was going to happen.
Yeah, well, that is interesting, because Treasures in Heaven comes out 2 years after Flower in the Skull. Mm-hmm. You're right. If you already had so much of the material sort of in motion, then it was just a matter of going back and polishing it before sending it forward. Okay, because I was going to ask you the same thing. You know, when and how did you work with these three novels? Because they were published in such proximity. But now I've got the answer.
Right.
It's sort of like the patience of it.
Started. Yeah. Yes, and most of it was just doing research to make the 19th century setting accurate. But as I discovered how people lived and what was important to people, because that has also shifted now between then and now. We think of our lives in very different ways. And people then were, for the first time, discovering that they could have agency. They could act as individuals as opposed to just acting as a group. They had more choices, which wasn't necessarily easier. So the people who didn't conform, who didn't fit in that society, had to go out and find a way to stay alive and to make a living and to be true to themselves.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting because not too long ago I interviewed Isabel Allende for the LA Times, and one of the things that I've always thought about Isabel Allende's work is that, aside from the subject matter, is that she loves history, because so many of her novels are really based in history, historical timelines, historical events. But I would say the same thing about you. I mean, do you love history? Because it seems like you do, based on because you teach so much of history in your books.
I guess I do. I love doing the research. I love finding the obscure little facts about things that other people have not come across. With Spirits of the Ordinary, I wrote that before we had the internet to bring all of these facts to our fingertips. I had to go to real libraries and use real books and read them, read all of them in order to glean what I needed for the book. So that's why, having started with Spirits of the Ordinary, by the time I got to The Flower of the Skull and then Treasures in Heaven, I had accumulated much more of that world. You know, it was very real to me. And I could go, oh, sure, this was the resource this person had at that time. Or this is what the law said, Napoleonic law as opposed to common law. And so things that I'd guessed about while I was working on Spirits of the Ordinary, I knew for sure by the time I got to the last book.
Yeah, and you know, this is one thing that I think younger writers don't have to contend with, the idea of actually going to a library and doing research, finding the books and maybe not finding the books. But also I think the power of imagination when you find it, when you don't find certain material,
Mm-hmm.
you come across gaps, when you come across, you know, dead ends, that you have to incorporate your own imagination. Not that young writers don't do it, but I don't know what their process is because, you know, I don't know if you had this experience in class, but it used to be before everybody had their access on their phones, that I would be in class and I would talk to people and say, what's the name of the book? And together we'd kind of collectively figure it out.
Right.
And now if I ask a question, somebody just looks it up right away. And I thought, you know, that takes the fun out of it. That takes the fun out of actually trying to, you know, excavate through the memories, right?
Yes, I find myself looking stuff up on my phone if I'm too lazy to get up and walk across the room where I know the book is.
Well, that's what I was going to ask you now is like, how's your process changed? Because if you were writing before, you know, how did your process change even to the present?
I have to admit that I use the internet to start, but I still use a lot of books and I still order a lot of books. There was something I wanted to read recently by one of the Clarion West students, the science fiction workshop. So he's in Brazil and he wrote a book in English and it was published in Scotland. So I had to order it from Scotland and probably pay a lot more than I should have. But I really just wanted to see what he had to say and what his approach to science fiction was, coming from that background and then coming and studying in the Northwest with a group of people.
Yeah, well, we're going to talk about science fiction in a bit, but before that, I want us to go back to the 90s because, you know, I'm sure that some scholar somewhere has already written this article about what was happening with Latinx and specifically Chicano literature in the 90s, because you had yours, I would say that yours were the first, 1992, Mrs. Vargas and the Dead Naturalist. And then in 1993, and let's see if you know you've read some of these books, Louis Garcia Robinson wrote this book called The Devil, Delfina Varela, and the Used Chevy, which took place in the Mission District of San Francisco. 1993, La Vanilla with Alfredo Vea.
Oh, yes.
In 1994, Ana Castillo, So Far From God.
Mm-hmm.
1997, Spirits of the Ordinary. But also 1997, Growing Through the Ugly, Diego Vasquez Jr. And these were all, you know, published by pretty much mainstream presses, big presses. So there was circulation. But all of these had these magical elements. I always sort of, I never want to say magical realism necessarily because I think that term has been completely misunderstood. And also magical realism is not only a property of Latin America, but of the world. There's so many cultures, so many literatures, you know, exercise magical realist elements in their work. Now somebody somewhere is going to go back to this period and determine why there was an interesting sort of nexus there with all of these books with magical elements in the 90s. Now, for you, what was it?
Well, I can tell you that it was probably 1974 when some of this Latin American literature in Spanish started getting translated into English. And that's when I read 100 Years of Solitude in English and thought, oh, this sounds just like my family stories. And I found a copy of it in Spanish and sent it to my parents. And they said, yes, it does sound like our family stories. So I was thinking about becoming a writer, but I had to go there the long way. I worked in press offices and worked in the documentary unit at KNBC in Los Angeles and at the Corporation for Public Broadcasting before we moved to the Northwest. And I went to graduate school. And that was when I started writing my short stories that became Mrs. Vargas and the Dead Naturalist. and also when I started getting published. So that was just, in between there were 4 years in Western Colorado, and I have no idea what happened in the rest of the world during that time. We were so isolated, and I think, did I hear about that? You know, there were several major events that went on between 1979 and 1983, but I was so out of touch that I didn't hear about it till later.
Yeah, and you do mention somewhere that when somebody kind of informed you, oh, you're writing magical realism,
Mm-hmm.
you had no idea, that you were. You were just writing the stories that you had learned how to tell. The storytelling was so part of your family, storytelling.
Yes, it was. And I just thought other people grew up in that kind of an environment. It was very specific. My mother was one of 9 surviving children who made it to adulthood. And whenever they got together, they would tell stories. And they didn't have the same shape as the kind of stories that I read or hear in the wider society of the United States. They were often didactic. They often didn't have endings. Um, they often had no other context than that group of people, but somehow you were supposed to know, what this meant. So it's always like coming in, just as the punchline is told, right? And you've missed the rest of the story. So I think it helped develop my imagination to have that kind of background of storytelling.
Yeah, and that's an interesting point about the different shapes of the storytelling, because I think for a long time that there was a misunderstanding of how to read our work, right? Because much of our work was actually influenced by this kind of storytelling, so that perhaps, or actually definitely American critics just don't have the same kind of frame of reference for our stories. But then when I hear that, I always think of, wow, there must be some really just badly read critics out there, because if you look at other literatures, like Jewish literature, for example, is so rich in that respect as well.
Right.
And same thing with indigenous storytelling, right?
Mm-hmm.
So and for you, I think there's a connection there in all 3.
Yes, there is certainly a connection in all 3. I just blanked, sorry.
Okay, I think
brain death.
That's okay. Also, I'm just spinning my wheels as I'm thinking about this, because your body of work is really rich. And I'll tell you why, for me, it just stands out. I mentioned this earlier to you, why it stands out. Firstly, because you're writing about a different century than most Latino, especially contemporary Latino writers, right? Secondly, your work, these works are set in Mexico, which is very different than many Latino writers. Latino writers, there's the literature of the border, the Southwest. There's the diasporas in other places like Chicago and the East Coast. But we're always going north. We're not necessarily going south. I think that development is very new, and I've been reading it in recent, in the last couple of years, maybe the last couple of years. I've been seeing this more often, that young writers are actually writing either portions of a novel. It's not completely set in Mexico, but they're going back to Mexico. It's a dude that took a couple of generations to go back. Like Erica Sanchez, and The Birth of the Mexican Daughter has a section where the young character goes down to Mexico. The novel Bang is about undocumented immigrants, and the characters go back to, or they're deported to Mexico. Amigo Land, Oscar Cáceres, also one of the brothers goes down to Mexico. Caramelo, also has a section in which going back to Mexico. But those are very, very recent developments. So
that's an interesting point.
Yeah, so you were doing all this. You were doing all that, you were doing all that back in the 80s and doing it well, right? But the other thing is, besides the Mexico, besides the history, is the intersection of identities, and I know that Chicano literature and other literatures, it's always about, well, we have to see ourselves, we have to be proud of our communities. And there is this important portrait that we present of our immigration histories, our immigration trajectories, but your intersection is quite complex, quite beautiful, because even from the first book, Spirits of the Ordinary, with the Jewish characters, right? With the Jewish lineage that's so important to the characters, and then also the Opata, character Magdalena, in her lineage, which you eventually explore in Flower in the Skull.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so all that richness is very unique.
Well, thank you for calling it richness instead of messiness. I think I wanted to reflect the reality of people who lived in the borderlands, and I grew up mostly in Southern California, but we went every year to Chihuahua, Mexico. We drove, which is a 2.5-day drive, and spent 2 weeks and then went back to our lives. And that was like, that part of my year was like in bright color, and the rest of my year was in very muted colors. It was a very special time for me to spend there. And I think many other people, I think Gustavo Arellano was talking about this, of so many people in Southern California who have that cross-border identity where they spent part of their childhood every year with their relatives, either on purpose so that they would learn Spanish or because their parents did something else during that time.
Right. Yeah.
So,
the babysitting, and that's almost like in my case, like, well, what are they gonna do here in the summer? Just stick around, play around, watch TV, or go to your cousins, go outside and play down across the border. Yeah. Definitely. Tell me more about your own sort of search for your own roots personally with the crypto-Jewish community, because it's one thing that is not discussed enough in Latin America, certainly in Mexico, is the presence of Jewish communities in the country. It's not, but go ahead.
well, it was difficult for many people in the smaller communities, rural New Mexico or places like Colombia, where it could be dangerous to be Jewish until maybe 20 years ago. So people did hide it, and the church was trying to sort of expose these people and bring them out. So it took a while before people were comfortable with that. I think a lot of it was just with transportation and the media. People were exposed to a wider world and thought, oh, there are other people here like me. And I didn't know that there was anyone outside of my immediate family who had this background until I spoke with someone here in Seattle. I recently wrote an article that talks about that a little bit. I met a man named Isaac Myman, who was Sephardic and taught Ladino at his local synagogue. And I interviewed him for Raven Chronicles, the magazine. And afterwards I said, well, people in my family say we might have some of this background. And he turned around and started asking me all these questions. He said, did they light candles on Saturday night, Friday night? Did they play cards and talk about Torah? And I thought, no. But he made me understand that this was a phenomenon that had taken place all over the world, that it wasn't just my family. Because when I was told about it, nobody ever said anything about the Inquisition, right? That's the key. It was just, oh, well, no wonder nobody said anything about it, right? So since then, I've off and on done research and relied a lot on family members who did research themselves. Now, we finally closed the gap between who we are and who our ancestors were within the last year, because we commissioned a genealogy in order to apply for Spanish citizenship. So I didn't know if you know that happened.
Yeah, I think it wasn't for the a kind of reparation for the Jewish community that was exiled or thrown out from Spain.
Yes.
Correct?
And it sounded like a great idea at the time. My son wanted to do it. And so I thought, well, okay. But I can't tell you how much paperwork it was.
Really? I think it might be easier just to move there, because I think it also has a rule that says if you live there for like 2 years, you can become a citizen.
Yeah.
Like many European.
I think you have to have a lot of money, though.
Yeah.
We have that in the United States as well. If you bring enough money with you, you can become a citizen. So that's part of the puzzle. So I feel somewhat ambiguous about that. It hasn't been approved yet. We're still waiting. But I know that Ben has plans if
What do you think that will do
comes
for you
through.
though? Because you have that history where you know that, I mean, not that the Spanish, are very popular in most of Latin America because of the colonial history, but in this case, I mean, it's about the Spanish exiling,
Right,
how
it is. It's about reclaiming something that was taken from us. And so in that respect, I do feel that this can be a good thing. So I'm not trying to hide, my feelings either way. I'm ambiguous about it. Um, I'm not thrilled that this happened in the past, but on the other hand, we need to look forward. And my son is a citizen of the world. He's already traveled all over, and people who've grown up working online, he has colleagues in Poland, um, all over. So I think that we deserve to, I mean, they deserve for us to give them a chance to repair the world, which is what tikkun means, this notion that we can repair the world.
it's a beautiful word. Um, it's interesting that here we are, we're both of us are digital immigrants, meaning that, we came of age during a time that, we didn't have access to these tools. And here we are almost celebrating, or at least finding something positive in social media. Because the other thing that social media has done in Mexico is, there was always this notion that, Mexicans are Catholic, which is, now we know it's not true, not everybody, that Mexicans are mestizo, which is not always true, which is descendants of Spanish and indigenous. But then how about those groups that are actually descendants of slaves, right?
Mm-hmm.
And who are not descendants of Spaniards. And so I think that's an interesting sort of development in Mexico, the Afro-Mexicans, the Afro-Mexican
Yes,
community.
they're finally being acknowledged.
Exactly.
Of course, they've been with us all along, and yeah, I think Mexico has been a little slow to acknowledge some parts of its history. When I was reading this history for Spirits of the Ordinary, I came across so many things that seemed like an avenue. I could go down here and learn all of this, or I could go down here and learn all of this. And that was part of it, was the history of Veracruz with African Mexicans.
Yeah.
And there's a great book that I came across in Spanish that was about To Honor and Obey, which was marriage law in Mexico. And there was a person who, his in-laws were suing to say that their daughter couldn't marry him because he was Black. And he said, I'm not Black because I'm in the army and I carry a sword for um, the country of Spain. By definition, I'm not Black. And the court said, he's right. He can marry your daughter.
Well, that's so interesting.
Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah, but that's the other thing that I especially love of A Space of the Ordinary, is that all of these notions of identity, all of these notions of even feminism, which we might get into now, that the female power, female agency, to sort of find it located in this space in a space of hardship, in a space of struggle, in a place of resistance, and yet there are these women that inhabit this space and are able to triumph in their own ways. And I think I like that. So when we say, oh, Mexico's always been with us, the Jewish community has always been with us, it's always been us, they say, well, the strong women, which is another thing that I think people misunderstand about Mexico, the notion of, well, the Mexican woman is subservient, And I think, well, if you really look deep into people's history, you see that the strong woman is very much part of every story.
Sure. And I have to say that Treasures in Heaven is not based on family history, but I came across this treasure trove of information about the feminist movement in Mexico at that time. And I thought, I can't let this go. I can't let this continue to sit in a cardboard box in the basement of Los Archivos in Mexico City. I'm going to write a book about this. And it seemed natural for Estela to continue as a character into that book.
Yes.
So there's just so much there. that that we can continue to look at the history and write new stories based on old facts, right?
Yes. Well, now I want to bring it to two of my other favorite characters. And I think these were the ones that drew me in for some mysterious reason. And those were the twins, Membrillo and Manzana. Right? And I remember when I first saw the hardcover of that at the bookstore, and your name, of course. And I think I mentioned that Alcalá is also my mother's maiden name. So
Yes.
of course, my eye was going to immediately snag on this name, and also this beautiful cover, alluring cover. And the twins, for some reason, even though there's no twins in my family, not that I don't have any particular affinity towards twins, but those twins, I think, are just so memorable that, I mean, you can't shake them.
Yes, I think a lot of people felt that way. They've been remarked on to me more than any other character in the book. So, do you want to hear the story of how they came about?
Yes.
Okay. Well, when I was writing this book, I used to ride the bus in Seattle, and the number 15. And there were a couple of people who often would get on the bus with me, and they were elderly twin sisters. And they would dress identically down to the little bee pin on their lapels. And I thought, oh, these people have to go in my book. I don't know anything about them except that I see them on the bus, but they're just too good to let go. So when I sat down to write about them, what came out instead were the twins, Membrillo and Manzana. And for those of you who haven't read the book, they are androgynous twins. One is slightly male and one is slightly female. And they refuse to be dressed differently from each other. So finally their family gives up and goes, okay, we give up. You're whoever you are. So maybe that's why why they appeal to you, Rigo, because you've spent all your life just trying to be who you are, right?
Exactly.
And so there they are.
Yeah, it was quite beautiful. And I think that another way in which you were ahead of your time, which I point out in my forward, because now the non-binary is part of our just consciousness, but we had a different idea of what non-binary was, but yet we have an illustration of it right there in this novel published in 1997.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I wrote it and I thought, oh, well, medically, this probably isn't possible to have for twins to have the traits that these two have. But after that, I read this big long article that said there's a lot we still don't know about twins. And that was 20 years ago. We probably know a little bit more, but we're still, even though we think we've unscrambled the genetic code, we keep being surprised at the things that are possible and the ways, the people who are possible.
Yeah. I read somewhere, and maybe you can tell us a little bit more about this, that there was a play based on Spirits of the Ordinary. Did you ever see it?
Yes. We used to have a group of writers in Seattle called Los Norteños. And then a couple of them moved to Portland, Oregon and became Los Porteños. And there's Miracle Theater is a playhouse and a company there. And so they, let's see, somebody remind me, what's the name of the director there? Who directed my play? Probably
Olga Sanchez.
Olga, thank you, Donna. Olga Sanchez sat down with me and wrote Spirits of the Ordinary as a play. And it was staged and was on the stage for a month in Portland. So that was a trip.
Can you tell me a little bit more? I mean, how did they envision did just do a piece or?
As a writer, I'm working with words, and a theater person like Olga is working with emotion. And so that was very different from me to collaborate and also to work on that level, physicality and emotion, because that's what you're trying to elicit with a play. You can read a story or you can have someone tell you a story, but a drama, which is probably my favorite art form, a drama just has to grab you at a different level. So I think I cried during the premiere of the play, just because I was so, probably nobody else understood what was going on in the play, but I was really affected by it.
Yeah. I read somewhere that you are a council member of the Obata Nation. Right?
Yes,
And
we're sort of getting it
Yeah.
together here. The second book of the trilogy is called The Flower in the Skull, and is based on the history of my mother's mother's mother. Her grandmother was a member of the tribe, of the Opata tribe in the Sonoran Desert. And my grandmother was the product of a rape, and at the age of 15 married my grandfather. So she was half Opata and half Irish. And I never knew her. She died shortly before I was born. And then my grandfather died shortly after I was born. So nobody knew anything about the Opata. We just had the name, we just had the word. But I went to a library in Arizona at the Amarin Foundation, and I went through every single book that might have anything on the indigenous people of the Southwest. Sometimes I would just find like a sentence. Sometimes I would find a paragraph. And so I went through and found every single thing I could find about the Opata and wrote a book. And then I thought, well, that was a nice exercise, just a sort of memorial to these people I came from. But then after the book was published, one person wrote to me, and we were now in the age of the internet, right? We now had email addresses. We now had 400 copies of the AOL disc in our mail. And one person and then another wrote to me and said, well, I'm part Opata, my grandfather. I remember some of these things, and I remember some of these words. And pretty soon there was a whole group on Yahoo Chat in Mexico. And so people have continued to stay in contact with each other, and we're now going to go ahead and do the paperwork to become a recognized tribe. So it's come a long way from that. Just today I was working with some of the symbols. I'm going to ask a graphic designer to make some stationery for a foundation that we're setting up to raise money for the tribe.
Did you ever think they were going to be this kind of activist? Because that is an activist.
Never. I never would have dreamed it. But yes, what are you going to do? This falls in your lap. You can't let it go.
Yeah, it certainly shows a commitment not only to the substance that inspired your work, but now taking it into your own life. Same thing with Judaism. I believe you converted. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
This is real, Kathleen. You're like walking the walk. You're not just, because I think that it's so easy to romanticize these certain elements of our past. Right, and then they become sort of quaint elements in our work, but you've taken it to another level, which is an experiential level. It's real, and it's your life.
Well, thank you for saying that, because I often feel that I'm very lazy. I'm not enough of a social activist, even though, over the last few years, I can't tell you how many times I was marching in the street, but it's still not enough somehow. So maybe by following through on these things that are true to my own life, I can offer a future to other people.
Yeah. Well, I'll give you a piece of advice that I always tell my students, because I remember doing the big marches that they were conflicted about wanting to go out to the streets, or why should we be in the classroom? Why should we be at the writing desk? And I said, well, that's one way to look at it. I said, the other way to look at it is that, so many of us can go out into the streets, but how many of us are going to write it down?
Right.
Can write it down, right? And so I think you're that person that writes it down, and that's important.
Well, and I think it's important to hear a lot of stories. You meet people who have amazing stories, but you're right, they won't ever write them down. And so we become a conduit at some point. We become a cajon in Mexico, you become a medium for other things going on around you. So I think we can do that. I certainly see that in your work, and I hope to have bits and pieces of that in mine.
Yeah. Well, I want to talk a little bit about the science fiction. Only
Okay.
because I think you're way ahead of the time, because not until recently am I seeing, sort of a speculative fiction, in Latinx literature really gaining some momentum. And I'll give you a couple of titles. In 2014, Manuel González wrote this novel called The Regional Offices Under Attack. 2017, The Kingdom of Women, Rosalí Morales Current, which I love that. I love that book. Very risk-taking. The anthology Latino Rising, 2017. In 2019, Fernando Flores, Tears of the Truffle Pig, also takes place in the future. And then in 2022, part of the U of A titles will be The Book of Wanderers by Reyes Ramirez, also very futuristic. And so this is only what? 14 and then 17, 19. It's very, very, very recent, right? But I think that so much of your work in Mrs. Vargas, The Naturalist, as 1992.
Yes. I don't know. I've always liked science fiction. There was a library in my elementary school that nobody used. So I would go in, and there was a shelf. There was a shelf about 4 feet long of science fiction books. And I started at one end and read all the way to the other end. In part because this is the closest thing I saw to the kinds of stories that we grew up with, right? In fact, behind me is a book. I always end up doing this, but I'm tethered to the computer, by one of my relatives. And they're stories of intrigue and mystery. It's in Spanish. He was in Mexico. And you look at them and you think, well, this is really science fiction in its time. These are stories that people told to each other to terrify each other, right? But they also imagine things that people have not seen. So it exercises your brain in a different way, that this is a possibility. There are many more possibilities in the world than just what we see in front of us. And so I just have always been attracted to that sort of thing.
Yeah. I'm curious what we're going to call it though. I think African Americans have, that the amazing field, could call it Afrofuturism. Right? And I wonder what ours is going to be called. Maybe we should name it.
There is, other than indigenous futurisms, I've been using that quite a bit. And
okay.
This has been going on. If I think of a really good term, Rigo, I'll run it by you. We'll see what happens.
We got to put it out there. We got to put the essay out there. I think we're finally doing this, and it's a different momentum than African American literature, right?
Yeah, though it's Afrofuturism is so amazing because it's based in music. It's based in jazz, and people picking that up and running with that and talking about it and incorporating it into their fiction. So. I did write an essay called Tasting the Cedar, which is taken from the salmon that swim upstream here. And the indigenous people said, well, they go until they can taste the cedar from their home stream, and they know to go up that stream at that point. And so I wrote an essay about indigenous futurisms that incorporates the stories from the past, but always look forward.
Again, you're ahead of the game, Kathleen. I don't know what to say.
I'm just barely keeping up. I'm not ahead of the game.
Well, I think you are. You're being very modest about the whole thing, but it's wonderful to see you continue on this. And I'll be. Who knows what your next project is going to be? You don't have to tell us. I know some writers never tell us, but I'm always looking forward to your next projects. We have about 10 minutes. I don't know if there are any questions from any of the. Phoebe, how do we handle this? Are there any questions in the chat box for Kathleen, or I don't know if there's in the Facebook Live, if there's any activity there in terms of.
There are a lot of comments. I really think maybe we should just open it up and see if anybody has, people can talk, because there's not exactly questions, but there's many, many comments so if anyone is interested in asking a question, they can unmute and ask a question.
Yeah, so you're welcome to join the conversation here.
Well, I'm
Go
looking
ahead.
now at some of the chat, and Linda Bookie says, I was thinking of the ties to Jewish literature and the mystical, magical elements there. And Stephanie answers, yeah, the Midrashim and how those stories are kind of magical and didactic, and also somehow mysterious and funny. So that's one in terms of Jewish storytelling. Let's see. You need to put that play of Kathleen's on the stage here on BI. Oh, thank you, Henrietta. Well, I forgot to say that Spirits of the Ordinary and Treasures in Heaven have been optioned for Hollywood. So that's the first time that has happened. And, you know, typically, if anything comes of this, it's because a well-known actor decides it's a good vehicle for him or her. So maybe, you know, Selma Hayek or someone will
We'll do something with it.
we'll do something with it, right?
Yeah, in Hollywood, you just gotta let it go.
Yeah.
You have very little control over anything to do, but you know, I remember
Right.
a number of people that have told me their horror stories about being optioned, and then you know they think that that there's going to be a preservation of the integrity of the book, and it turns to be something else because you're like, wow, you know, whatever, just cash the check, right?
That's what I hear from
Right?
some people is take the money and run and
Yeah.
don't get too attached to the property. And I think that's, you know, I just read a description of Midnight Cowboy and how it came together. It was just an amazing serendipity that all of these actors and directors and everyone came together to create what was an amazing book for that time. I think it was 1968
Yeah.
that it was made. So it's very seldom that somebody gets everything they want if they wrote the book and then it's adapted to a movie.
Lorna Lee, do you have a comment?
Well, I'm really fascinated by your cultural background, Kathleen. And also you mentioned, I think, a book on your bookshelf that a family member had written. So I'm curious about your literary background. And you said, you know, I wanted to be a writer. And then, well, how did that all happen?
That's a good question. My parents were not writers, but let's see, my mother's aunt married a man who was a writer, and she was a painter. And if you can see the painting behind me, that's one of her paintings up there on the wall. So that would have been my great aunt and uncle. And they lived in Saltillo, Mexico, which is a city, a big city now of maybe 1 million people in northeastern Mexico. My parents did not have the same sort of upper class background in that because of the Mexican Revolution. Everybody lost everything. And my grandfather, on top of that, my mother's father, was disinherited. So he had nothing and became a Methodist minister and dragged his family all over northern Mexico and the southwestern United States and started churches. So he was not a writer, but I have all of his diaries. And he did write down a lot of very interesting things. So that was, besides the research, Rigo, that I've talked about, having access to his notebooks and diaries really gave me an insight into what life was like at the time and also into someone else's interior life. I've never read all of somebody else's diaries or notes. So here I was with this man from another century, really, who was keeping notes just of his day-to-day life, but also for his sermons and stuff. But through his work, through their train rides and the towns they lived in, and the horses and the automobiles and always on the move, I was able to, again, channel these lives from that time, from that era.
Yeah.
So does that answer your question, Lorraine?
Yeah, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
It's a curiosity that goes through the genes, right? The curiosity plus the memory.
Maybe that's it. well, speaking of what we don't know about genetics, the epigenetics, right, where other memories or other actions are triggered by your environment. So maybe I was in the right environment. I was thinking about that earlier this evening, though, this notion of how often people will go through it, especially people who've had a terrible time, who've come out of war. They don't write books as a rule. They are usually too traumatized. They're in silence in that way, but their children or their grandchildren write those books. They're able to gather that information together and write the books that then let the rest of us know what that experience was like.
Mm-hmm. Are there any other questions? Then we have a few more minutes.
Yes, Ellen has a question.
Yeah, I was curious, Kathleen, about whether you had anything had come through family stories, either about the Kabbalah, which you have kind of woven through it, the Jewish mysticism, or the experiences of persecution, you know, that you describe, or did you have to fill that in imaginatively and through research?
I pretty much had to fill that in. As I said, well, what happened specifically with me was at the age of 9, I read the Old Testament. And I told my mother that I wanted to be Jewish. And she said, well, we were Jewish, but we're not anymore. So if you think that's not confusing for a 9-year-old. And that's sort of where it sat, right, for another 20 years or so. And so, no, I did not get any of the stories of the Inquisition or of the Kabbalah from my family. But I think that, I don't want to say that this is necessarily Mexican, but I think that there's an affinity for mysticism that came in the family that was reflected in those stories. My father, on the other hand, was a very practical man, and he was an only child, and he never had a chance to tell his stories with, you know, my mother and her 8 brothers and sisters. And so I've learned more about his family from his cousins in Mexico who live in Aguascalientes. And I've been in, as Rigo was saying, the magic of the internet. Now we are in contact with people we would not be in contact with otherwise. So I have visited them twice, and they have said, well, you know, we think our grandparents were Jewish as well because of the way they used to talk to each other. So that was the first time I'd heard it on his side of the family too. And I will tell you a little bit about what I'm working on, Rigo, which is a novel. And like my other novels, it's written in a very episodic way. Often I write chapters that can stand by themselves. So that has happened with the first 2 chapters. But they're set partly in the United States and partly in the city of Aguascalientes, which is in the exact geographic center of the country of Mexico.
That's all you're going to tell me?
Yeah.
Wow, what a tease. The location, okay. Well, that's a start. That's something.
I'll tell you the name of it, the working title. Would you like that?
Okay.
Okay, it's called Los Volladores.
Los Voladores.
Los Voladores.
Voladores. Okay.
De vaca.
Okay, why Voladores? Oh, you're not going to tell me that?
No, you're going to have to go look it up if you care. It's a real thing.
I'm trying to remember if Aguascalientes, there's this, if it's the shape of the state. I'm trying to remember the shape of the state because I think one of them is in the shape of they call it the shape of a bear. And I don't know if Aguascalientes, can't remember now. I have to look at the map.
Yeah.
One of the states has this shape, and they call it, oh, that's the shape of the bear. I wonder if it's.
Well, it's a tiny little state,
yeah.
Mostly taken up by the city of Aguascalientes.
Yeah.
The name of the city and the state are longer than the state is itself.
I think we're out of time, Phoebe. I think that we're going to conclude this conversation. So I do want to thank again Phoebe, Raven Chronicles, and especially Kathleen. What a treat! It's been years since we had more than a passing chat. Usually AWP, and so this was wonderful. It was a great treat for me and an honor to speak with you about
Yes.
your work.
Thank you so much, Rigo. I really appreciate it. And again, I really appreciate all the rest of you for coming tonight, and Raven Chronicles for bringing this book back into print. It makes me so happy. So those of you who haven't read it, I hope you enjoy it.
Thanks, Kathleen. Thanks for
you.
everyone. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you.
you,
Thank you so much.
Good night.
Kathleen.